Today, I've got a story about a pizza delivery driver who walked into a bank carrying a homemade gun and wearing a live bomb locked around his neck. A few hours earlier, he had simply gone out to deliver 2 pizzas to a remote address outside Erie, Pennsylvania. By the time police caught him, he was insisting that he wasn't really the robber at all. What investigators eventually uncovered was a bizarre scavenger hunt, a body hidden in a freezer, a murder-for-hire plot, and a group of people who may never have intended for him to survive. Now, if you enjoy true stories that somehow get stranger every time you think you understand them, you're in exactly the right place. Around here, those are the ones we can't resist. Before we get started, please hand the like button a fresh pizza, tell them delivery is free, and then casually mention there's one small device attached to the box they probably shouldn't tamper with. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next strange case. All right, let's get into it. It's a warm Thursday afternoon in Erie, Pennsylvania, and a 46-year-old pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells is having what should be a completely ordinary shift. Brian is the kind of guy people barely notice. He lives alone, keeps to himself, delivers pizzas, goes home. Nothing about his life suggests that before the day is over, his name is going to be tied to one of the strangest crimes in American history. Sometime that afternoon, the pizza shop gets an order for 2 pizzas. The delivery address is unusual. It isn't a house or an apartment. It's out near a television transmission tower on the edge of town, down a quiet road where there really isn't much of anything. Brian takes the order, and from that moment on, almost everything becomes a mystery. A little while later, Brian walks into a PNC bank. He isn't wearing a mask. He isn't trying very hard to hide his face, and he doesn't look like some hardened criminal who has spent months preparing for this. He looks nervous. In his hand is this bizarre homemade object that resembles a walking cane. But inside the cane is a functional shotgun. Brian approaches a teller and hands her a note demanding $250,000. Now, the teller can't possibly get that much money together in the short amount of time the note gives her, so she collects what she can, $8,702, and gives it to him. Brian takes the money and walks out. Already, this is a strange bank robbery. But the people inside that bank don't know the most important part yet. Under Brian's shirt, locked around his neck, is a heavy metal collar. And attached to that collar is a bomb. Not something he can simply unbuckle. Not something he can slide over his head. This thing is secured around his neck, with a metal box and explosive components sitting against his chest. According to Brian, he did not put it there. He says that when he arrived near that television tower to deliver the pizzas, people waiting there forced the collar onto him. Then they handed him the strange cane gun and a set of written instructions. And the instructions basically told him, if you want to survive, do exactly what we say. Rob the bank. Take the money. Then begin following a series of clues scattered around the area. It was almost like a scavenger hunt, except every wrong turn and every wasted minute mattered, because Brian had been told the device around his neck was on a timer. Somewhere along the route, he was supposedly going to find what he needed to keep progressing toward a way to remove the bomb. So after leaving the bank, Brian doesn't just disappear with the cash. He starts following the instructions. But police are already looking for him. Not far from the bank, near a McDonald's, officers spot Brian's vehicle and move in. They order him out, take him into custody, handcuff him, and sit him down on the pavement. And this is where the whole situation changes, because Brian starts telling the officers that he was forced to rob the bank. Then he tells them there's a bomb around his neck. At first, imagine how insane that must have sounded. A man has just robbed a bank with a homemade gun. Police catch him almost immediately, and now he's saying, "No, you don't understand. I'm the victim here." But then the officers actually look at the device, and suddenly nobody wants to get close to him. They back away. They clear the area. They call the bomb squad. Brian is left sitting there on the pavement with his hands cuffed behind his back, surrounded by police officers who can see him and talk to him, but who can't safely approach. And Brian is getting more anxious by the minute. He keeps telling them the bomb is real. He keeps telling them he doesn't have much time. The officers don't know if he's telling the truth. They don't know if the device is fake, if Brian built it himself, or if there are other people somewhere nearby watching all of this unfold. All they can do is wait for the bomb technicians. But Brian knows something they don't. If the instructions he was given are accurate, waiting is the one thing he cannot afford to do. And as he sits there, helpless, with that metal collar locked tightly around his neck, a sound begins coming from the device. A rapid electronic beeping. Brian looks at the officers. The officers look back at him. And in that moment, everyone at the scene finally understands the same thing. Whatever this is, the countdown has almost reached 0. The first thing the officers had to decide was whether Brian Wells was lying. And honestly, from their point of view, that was not an unreasonable question. They had just caught a man who had robbed a bank. He had a homemade gun in his car. He had thousands of dollars in stolen cash. And now, only after being arrested, he was claiming that none of it had really been his choice. But Brian was not acting like someone trying to talk his way out of a charge. He was terrified. He kept looking down at the metal box hanging from his neck. He told the officers that men had put it on him when he delivered pizzas to that remote television tower. He said they had given him the cane gun and a long set of instructions. Those instructions were supposed to lead him through a series of locations where he would find more clues and, eventually, a way to get the collar off. The problem was, police had stopped him before he could finish the route, and Brian believed the clock was still running. The officers could see enough of the device to know that nobody should touch it casually. Thick metal bands surrounded Brian's neck. A box sat against his chest. Wires ran between parts of the mechanism. There were components that looked very much like explosives, so they moved everybody back. Brian stayed where he was, his hands still cuffed behind him. That detail would later become one of the most haunting parts of the scene, because once police decided the device might be real, they were in an impossible position. They could not safely get close enough to remove the cuffs, but leaving Brian restrained meant he could not even try to help himself. So he sat there. Officers kept the area clear. People inside nearby businesses watched from behind windows, trying to understand why a bank robbery suspect was sitting alone inside a police perimeter. And Brian kept talking. He told the officers there was more information inside his car. When police looked, they found pages of typed instructions. These were not vague directions like, drive here and wait. They were elaborate. The writer seemed obsessed with controlling every move Brian made. The pages told him where to go, what to look for, what roads to take, and what to do when he reached each location. They warned him not to contact police. They warned him not to remove the collar. They warned him that wasting time could get him killed. It was like somebody had designed a game, except the person playing it had a bomb around his neck. According to the instructions, robbing the bank was only one step. Afterward, Brian was supposed to travel to different points around Erie, retrieve more notes, and keep moving. The implication was that if he followed the entire sequence correctly, he could eventually save himself. Brian clearly believed that promise mattered. He repeatedly tried to tell police that he needed to keep moving. But there was no way the officers were going to let an armed bank robbery suspect get back into his car and continue driving around town with an explosive device attached to him. So they called specialists. The bomb squad was on its way. And for everyone at the scene, that sounded like the safest possible decision. Wait for the experts. Don't touch the device. Keep Brian isolated. But the people who had built this thing appeared to have anticipated exactly that. Because if Brian's story was true, they had not just given him a bomb. They had given him a schedule. Every minute police spent doing the responsible thing was another minute Brian lost. At one point, Brian asked how much longer the bomb squad would take. Then the device started making noise. A series of beeps came from the box. Brian heard it too. His whole demeanor changed. He told them again that it was going to explode. The officers backed farther away. There was nothing they could safely do. Running toward him might kill them as well. Trying to cut the collar without knowing how it worked could trigger it immediately. So Brian sat alone while everyone watched from a distance. And that is what makes the scene from that afternoon so difficult to forget. Because once you know what is around his neck, it stops looking like an arrest. It looks like an execution nobody knows how to stop. Brian glances around. He speaks to the officers. He waits. And somewhere inside that metal box, a mechanism continues moving toward whatever it was designed to do next. By this point, Everybody at the scene understands that they are dealing with something far more serious than a bank robbery. Brian Wells is sitting on the pavement near the McDonald's, his hands cuffed behind his back, with this heavy metal collar locked around his neck. Police cruisers are positioned around him. Officers are keeping their distance. Traffic is being pushed back. People nearby are being told to stay away. And right in the middle of all of it is Brian, alone. He keeps trying to explain what happened. He says the men at the television tower put the device on him. He says they gave him the homemade gun. He says they ordered him to rob the bank. And most importantly, he keeps insisting that the bomb around his neck is on some kind of timer. He needs to keep moving. He needs to follow the instructions. He does not have time to sit there. But think about this from the officer's perspective for a second. They have no idea who Brian really is. Maybe he is telling the truth. Maybe he helped build the device himself. Maybe the collar is fake. Maybe there is someone watching the scene from a nearby building with a remote trigger. Nobody knows. So the officers do what they are trained to do. They call the bomb squad and wait. And under normal circumstances, waiting for the specialists would be exactly the right decision. But this situation is not normal. Because if Brian is telling the truth, then every second they spend waiting is bringing him closer to death. At one point, an officer asks Brian about the device, and Brian tries to describe what he knows. He does not know how to remove it. He does not know exactly how it works. All he knows is what the people who put it on him told him. Follow the instructions, complete the tasks, and somewhere along the route he will supposedly get what he needs to escape. Now he cannot continue that route. He is stuck. And he knows it. You can actually see the change in him as time passes. At first, Brian is talking constantly, almost like if he can just explain the situation clearly enough, somebody will understand and let him continue. Then he becomes more restless. He shifts on the ground. He looks toward the officers. He asks about the bomb squad. He looks down at the metal box. And then the device begins to beep. That sound changes everything. Because until that moment, there is still some tiny possibility that this whole thing is just an elaborate bluff. But Brian hears the beeping and immediately reacts. He knows what it means. He tells the officers the bomb is going to go off. The officers can hear it too. Nobody moves toward him. And that might sound cold until you remember what they are looking at. This is not a small object someone can grab and throw away. It is physically locked around Brian's neck. If an officer runs over and starts pulling at it, he could trigger the bomb and kill Brian, himself, and anyone else standing nearby. So they stay back. Brian is now sitting in this open area with a ring of people around him who desperately want to help but cannot safely get close. And the bomb squad still has not reached him. Minutes pass. The beeping continues. Brian becomes visibly more anxious. He tells the officers again that he does not have much time. Then, for a moment, the beeping stops. And that might sound like good news, but it isn't. At approximately 3:18 that afternoon, the device around Brian Wells's neck detonates. There is a violent blast. The force tears into his upper chest and neck. Brian collapses onto the pavement. And in an instant, the argument over whether the bomb is real is over. It was real. Very real. The officers rush in only after the immediate danger has passed, but there is nothing they can do to save him. Brian Wells, 46 years old, pizza delivery driver, bank robber, possible hostage, whatever he really is at this point, is dead. And the most painful part is the timing. The bomb squad arrives just minutes after the explosion. Just minutes. Now, it is easy to hear that and immediately think if they had gotten there a little sooner, maybe Brian would have survived. But as investigators would later discover, the people who designed this device had made sure things were not that simple. The collar was not some crude pipe bomb tied around a man's neck with string. It was a sophisticated, deliberately constructed mechanism. There were multiple locking points. There were wires and false components. There were features that appeared designed specifically to discourage anyone from tampering with it. Even an experienced bomb technician would have needed time to understand what he was looking at. And then investigators found something else that made the entire situation even darker. They began studying the written instructions recovered from Brian's car. They mapped the route he had been told to follow. They looked at the distances between locations. They looked at how much time he had apparently been given. And slowly, a disturbing possibility emerged. Brian may never have had enough time to complete the entire scavenger hunt. In other words, the instructions that promised him a way out may have been a lie from the beginning. Maybe there was no realistic path to safety. Maybe the purpose of the scavenger hunt was not to help Brian remove the bomb. Maybe it was simply designed to keep him moving long enough to rob the bank, confuse the police, scatter evidence across multiple locations, and then make sure the one person who could identify everyone involved would never be able to talk. And if that was true, then Brian Wells had not been sent into that bank with a bomb around his neck as leverage. He had been sent in wearing his own death sentence. But investigators still had a huge problem. They did not know who had built the collar. They did not know who had written the instructions. They did not know who had been waiting at that television tower. And they did not even know for certain whether Brian had really been an innocent delivery driver who walked into a trap. All they had was a dead man, a bizarre homemade weapon, a stack of cryptic instructions, and one of the strangest explosive devices any of them had ever seen. For a while, the case seemed almost impossible to untangle. And then, a few weeks later, a man called police and calmly told them something that appeared to have absolutely nothing to do with Brian Wells. He said there was a dead body hidden inside his house. Once Brian Wells was dead, investigators finally had the chance to look closely at the papers inside his car. And this is where the case stopped looking like a strange bank robbery and started looking like something almost impossible to believe. Because these were not just instructions telling Brian where to drive after the robbery. They were a game. A very carefully designed game. The pages were typed, detailed, and written in this cold, almost playful tone. Whoever created them had mapped out a route through the Erie area and broken it into a series of steps. Brian was supposed to complete one task, travel to another location, find another set of instructions, and then keep going. It was basically a scavenger hunt. Except instead of winning a prize at the end, Brian was supposedly trying to keep a bomb from exploding around his neck. The first major step had been the bank robbery. He had been ordered to enter the PNC Bank, demand $250,000, and leave quickly. After that, the instructions sent him to another location where he was supposed to find a container holding the next clue. Then, that clue would send him somewhere else. And somewhere along the chain, he had been promised that he would eventually receive information that could help him remove the collar. Now, imagine being an investigator looking at this for the first time. You know, Brian had actually followed at least part of the plan. He had gone to the bank. He had used the strange cane-shaped gun. He had taken the money. And after leaving the bank, instead of simply driving home or trying to flee the state, he had gone toward one of the locations described in these papers. So whatever this thing was, he had been taking it seriously. Police decided to retrace the route themselves, and almost immediately, they ran into a problem. At one of the designated locations, investigators found evidence that something had been placed there, but the next clue Brian was supposed to retrieve was no longer available in the way the instructions described. Some of the route markers and containers appeared to have been deliberately positioned ahead of time. The person who built this plan had driven around the area, selected isolated spots, and created a physical trail for Brian to follow. That meant this was not something improvised on the morning of the robbery. Someone had put real work into it. They had measured distances. They had selected roads. They had prepared written instructions. They had built a specialized weapon. And, of course, they had constructed the collar itself. The more investigators studied the bomb, the more disturbing that became. The device was heavy and complex. It had been built around a metal collar that could not simply be slipped off over Brian's head. The explosive portion was attached to the front, and the entire thing contained enough confusing wiring and components that anyone attempting to dismantle it would have had to work very carefully. Some elements appeared to serve no obvious purpose at all. That was important, because if you were trying to stop a bomb and you see a wire, you need to know what that wire does before you cut it. A fake wire can be almost as useful as a real one if its only purpose is to make the person trying to disarm the device hesitate. And whoever built this collar seemed to understand that. Investigators started asking a very simple question. Whoever did this, what exactly did they expect to happen? Because on paper, the scavenger hunt supposedly offered Brian hope. Follow the instructions correctly, move fast enough, and maybe you can reach the end. But when investigators started calculating the route, that promise began to look suspicious. Brian had been sent from place to place over a significant distance. He had to find hidden items, read new instructions, drive to new locations, and do all of it while carrying out a bank robbery and avoiding police. And remember, the people who wrote the plan obviously knew that the bank would call 911. They knew police would respond. They knew Brian might get stopped. In fact, the entire robbery practically guaranteed it. He was not wearing a disguise. He was driving his own vehicle. His face was visible. He was carrying a weapon so unusual that every witness would remember it. Nothing about the plan seemed designed to help Brian disappear afterward. Quite the opposite. It seemed designed to make sure everybody noticed him. So investigators began considering a darker explanation. What if Brian was never supposed to reach the end of the scavenger hunt? Think about what that would solve for the people behind the crime. They needed someone to physically enter the bank. Brian did that. They needed someone to carry the weapon. Brian did that. They needed someone to take all the risk of being photographed, identified, chased, and arrested. Brian did all of that too. And if the bomb eventually killed him, then the person who had actually walked into the bank could never tell police who had sent him there. The perfect bank robber, from the planner's point of view, might not be someone who could escape. It might be someone who could not survive. But there was another possibility investigators could not ignore. Maybe Brian had helped plan the robbery himself. Maybe the whole forced pizza delivery driver story was part of the scheme. After all, it was a strange coincidence that a man supposedly selected at random had followed complicated instructions well enough to rob a bank and begin the scavenger hunt. And there were little details that did not fit neatly into the image of a completely innocent hostage. So now police had two competing pictures of the dead man. In one, Brian Wells was exactly what he claimed to be: a pizza delivery driver who drove to the wrong place, encountered the wrong people, and had a bomb locked around his neck. In the other, Brian had known something about the robbery before he ever drove to that tower. But even if that second version was true, there was still a huge question. How much did he know? Because knowing that a robbery was going to happen is very different from agreeing to have a live bomb locked around your neck. And that distinction would eventually become one of the central mysteries of the entire case. For now, though, investigators had almost nothing solid. The bomb had killed the one person who might have been able to explain everything. The scavenger hunt seemed deliberately confusing. The delivery location was isolated, and whoever had created the plan appeared to have gone to extraordinary lengths to separate themselves from the actual robbery. Then, less than a month after Brian died, police received a phone call from a man named William Rothstein. Rothstein lived only a short distance from the television tower where Brian had delivered those pizzas. He was intelligent, mechanically skilled, and known for working on complicated projects in his garage. But when he contacted police, he did not call to talk about Brian Wells. He called about something else entirely. He calmly explained that there was a dead man inside his house. And before officers even arrived, Rothstein had already written a note. On that note, he made an oddly specific statement. He said the death of the man in his house had nothing to do with the Brian Wells case, which, of course, immediately gave investigators a reason to wonder why he had mentioned Brian Wells at all. Now, less than a month after Brian Wells died on that pavement, a man named William Rothstein picked up the phone and called 911. Rothstein lived at 8645 Peach Street, only a short distance from the television tower where Brian had gone to deliver those pizzas. Instead of calling about the collar bomb, though, he told police something so bizarre that for a moment it sounded like an entirely separate crime. Inside the garage, he said, there was a dead man in a freezer. Naturally, officers went to the house. When they arrived, Rothstein did not act like someone who had just been surprised by a body. He knew exactly who the dead man was. According to Rothstein, the victim was James Roden, the live-in boyfriend of a woman named Marjorie Dale Armstrong. Apparently, several weeks earlier, Dale Armstrong had contacted Rothstein and told him that she had shot Roden after an argument. Rather than calling police, Rothstein agreed to help her clean up. First, he went to her house. Then he helped wrap Roden's body, remove it from the scene, and bring it back to his own property. Eventually, he placed the body inside a chest freezer in his garage, where it remained for weeks. VLEX. So just think about what police are dealing with here. A pizza deliveryman has just died in a homemade collar bomb after robbing a bank, and now, barely 3 weeks later, a man who lives near the original pizza delivery location is standing in front of them with a frozen corpse in his garage. Normally, that kind of overlap would immediately get everyone's attention. Yet Rothstein seemed almost prepared for that question. Before police could even fully sort out the story, investigators found a handwritten note he had prepared. At the very beginning, Rothstein made a strangely specific point. This has nothing to do with the Wells case. That sentence was hard to ignore. Why mention Brian Wells at all unless you were already thinking about the possibility that police might connect the two cases? Rothstein also insisted that he had not killed Roden and had not taken part in the killing. Instead, he said D.L. Armstrong had done it, and that his role began afterward when she asked him to help dispose of the body. Wired. At first, investigators had a perfectly good reason to focus on Marjorie. She was not some random name Rothstein had pulled out of nowhere. Roden really was her boyfriend, and the evidence led police straight back to her. Within a day of Rothstein contacting authorities, D.L. Armstrong was arrested in connection with Roden's death. Later, she would plead guilty, but mentally ill to third-degree murder and receive a prison sentence for killing him, VLEX. But here's where the story takes another turn. Rothstein was not just some guy who happened to know Marjorie. Years earlier, the two had been romantically involved. More importantly, he was mechanically capable, comfortable with tools, and the kind of person who could work through complicated hands-on problems. Suddenly, investigators were looking at a man who lived near the pizza delivery site, knew the woman accused of murdering the person in his freezer, and had practical skills that made the collar bomb investigation impossible to ignore. Still, none of that proved he had anything to do with Brian, so police kept pulling at the thread. As they did, the murder of James Roden began to look less and less like an isolated domestic killing. One account suggested that Roden knew about the bank robbery plot before Brian Wells ever walked into the PNC Bank. Later testimony would claim that he had threatened to expose what was being planned. If that was true, then Roden had died shortly before the robbery, not because of some completely unrelated argument, but because he knew something somebody desperately needed kept secret. Time. Now the freezer did not look like a side story anymore. It looked like a doorway. Through that doorway was Marjorie D.L. Armstrong, and the more investigators learned about her, the stranger the case became. People who knew her described a woman who was extremely intelligent but also volatile, combative, and capable of becoming intensely fixated on money and personal disputes. Long before the collar bomb case, she had already been connected to another fatal shooting. Back in 1984, she had shot a boyfriend named Robert Thomas multiple times, but a jury acquitted her after she argued self-defense. Nearly 2 decades later, another boyfriend was dead, and this time his body had ended up hidden in Rothstein's freezer. http://vindyarchives.com. Meanwhile, investigators were beginning to realize that Rothstein's decision to call police might not have been an act of conscience. He told authorities that keeping Roden's body had been eating away at him, and that he had even considered suicide. Police found what appeared to be a suicide note, complete with apologies and the claim that he had not killed Roden. Yet the very existence of that note raised another uncomfortable possibility. Maybe Rothstein was not simply confessing. Perhaps he was trying to control the story before someone else did. After all, by calling police himself, he could present his version first. Marjorie was the killer, he was only the frightened helper, and whatever happened to Brian Wells was completely unrelated. That version gave him a reason for the corpse, a reason for the freezer, and a reason to distance himself from the biggest investigation in Erie. There was just one problem. Investigators were about to discover that Marjorie D.L. Armstrong, William Rothstein, and Brian Wells were not 3 strangers whose lives had crossed by coincidence. Their connections went much deeper than that. Eventually, prosecutors would argue that the body in the freezer, the collar around Brian's neck, and the robbery at the PNC Bank all belonged to the same tangled criminal world. Mid-page. And once police started putting those relationships together, they found another man whose story would blow the case wide open. His name was Kenneth Barnes. At that point, the question was no longer just who built the bomb. The much bigger question was why anyone would design such an insane robbery in the first place. Because according to the story investigators were about to hear, the answer had almost nothing to do with the bank. It had to do with murder.money, and one woman's plan to have her own father killed. Here is where this story stops being a bank robbery story. Because once investigators began looking at Marjorie D.L. Armstrong, William Rothstein, and the people around them, they realized something that made the entire collar bomb scheme even harder to process. The money from the bank may never have been the real objective. According to the case prosecutors eventually presented, the robbery was supposed to finance another crime, a murder. More specifically, Marjorie wanted someone to kill her own father. To understand how anybody gets from a family money dispute to putting a bomb around a pizza deliveryman's neck, you have to know a little more about Marjorie. She was undeniably intelligent. People who dealt with her also described someone who could be intensely argumentative, suspicious, and consumed by disputes that other people might have eventually let go. Money was one of those disputes. When Marjorie's mother died in 2000, Marjorie received an inheritance of about $250,000. Her father received far more, roughly $3 million. Instead of seeing that money as simply belonging to her father, Marjorie became convinced that he was wasting assets she believed would eventually pass to her. She also blamed PNC Bank, believing the bank was helping him spend through the money. That resentment appears to be where two completely different ideas began merging into one plan. First, get rid of her father. Second, rob the bank. Then use one crime to pay for the other. According to court records, Marjorie approached a man named Kenneth Barnes in early 2003. Barnes was someone she had known for years, and his life was not exactly heading in a quiet direction either. He had a criminal history and moved in the same loose circle of people that included Marjorie and Rothstein. Marjorie made him an offer. She wanted Barnes to kill her father, and she was willing to pay him $100,000. That is already an extraordinary conversation. Yet what makes it even stranger is where she expected that money to come from. Prosecutors said the payment would come from a bank robbery. Now the demand Brian Wells later carried into PNC Bank makes much more sense. He was ordered to ask for $250,000. So the bizarre caller, the cane gun, the scavenger hunt, and the bank robbery were not necessarily four separate pieces of insanity. They were parts of a single plan. Marjorie wanted money. Barnes was allegedly willing to kill for it. Rothstein had the kind of mechanical ability that suddenly mattered a great deal. Then there was James Roden. During a gathering at Barnes's home in June 2003, the robbery plan was discussed in front of several people, including Roden and Rothstein. Roden was Marjorie's boyfriend at the time. Unlike the others, he apparently did not react to the plan by asking how it could be done. He objected. More importantly, Roden threatened to go to police. Just sit with that for a moment. Weeks before Brian Wells ever walked into a bank, somebody inside this group knew enough about the plan to potentially destroy it. Then, before the robbery happened, that person ended up dead. Prosecutors said Marjorie shot Roden in the home they shared in August 2003. Afterward, Rothstein helped move the body and hide it inside the freezer at his house. Suddenly, that corpse police found after Rothstein's 911 call has a completely different meaning. James Roden was not merely Marjorie's murdered boyfriend. He may also have been a man who knew about the collar bomb robbery before it happened and had threatened to expose it. That possibility connected the freezer directly back to Brian Wells. And Rothstein was standing right in the middle of both worlds. Remember, Rothstein had once been engaged to Marjorie. He knew Barnes. Rothstein had also been present when the robbery was discussed. His role in hiding Roden's body was already established. On top of that, his home sat near the television tower where Brian's final pizza delivery had taken him. Mechanically, Rothstein was also unusually capable. As a former shop teacher, he had the kind of practical skill that investigators could not ignore when thinking about whoever helped create such a strange device. None of that, by itself, proved he built Brian's collar. But by this point, coincidence was becoming harder and harder to believe. The same small group kept appearing around every major piece of the case. Trace the bank robbery, and you came back to Marjorie and Barnes. Look at Roden's murder, and you came back to Marjorie and Rothstein. Start with the pizza delivery location, and Rothstein lived nearby. Ask why anyone wanted $250,000 in the first place, and investigators were led right back to the proposed murder of Marjorie's father. What had looked from the outside like a random act of elaborate cruelty was beginning to reveal a structure. The group needed money. Somebody had to physically rob the bank. Another person needed enough technical ability to help make the plan work. A weapon frightening enough to force cooperation was essential. Finally, the people behind the scheme needed distance between themselves and the actual robbery. The collar bomb solved several of those problems at once. Suppose the man entering the bank claimed he had been forced. That gave him an explanation for what he was doing. Once police believed him, attention might initially focus on mysterious kidnappers rather than willing accomplices. Should he complete the robbery, the real planners never had to walk into the bank themselves. And if the device exploded, the person who had actually carried out the robbery could never sit down with investigators afterward and explain who had been involved. That last part is especially hard to ignore. Federal prosecutors would later say that Brian Wells had played a limited role in planning the robbery, but that his position may have changed by the time the collar was locked around his neck. In other words, there was a possibility Brian knew there was going to be a robbery. He may even have agreed to participate in some version of it, but that does not mean he agreed to die. According to the government's eventual theory, the conspirators planned to make Brian look like a hostage, giving him an alibi if he survived and was arrested. At the same time, a real explosive collar meant that if things went wrong, Brian could also be permanently silenced. That creates a much more disturbing picture of the people involved. Nobody needed to trust anybody else. They only needed each other long enough to complete the next step. Marjorie needed Barnes. Barnes needed the robbery money. Someone in the group needed technical ability. Brian may have been useful because he could walk into the bank and take all the visible risk. Roden became dangerous because he knew too much and threatened to talk. Once you look at the case that way, the entire plan starts to feel less like a team of criminals working together and more like a group of people building a trap around one another. Eventually, one of them would start talking. That person was Kenneth Barnes. After Barnes ran into serious legal trouble of his own, investigators got an opportunity to hear the story from someone who had been inside this circle. What he told them helped transform years of suspicion into a federal case. But his account also introduced the question that still hangs over Brian Wells more than any other. If Brian really had known about the bank robbery beforehand, why did he look so terrified once police stopped him? The answer may be that the robbery he thought he was joining and the robbery that actually happened were not the same plan at all. Until this point, Brian Wells has looked like the easiest person in this entire story to understand. He was the pizza deliveryman who drove to the wrong place, had a bomb locked around his neck, robbed a bank because he was terrified, and died before anyone could save him. Then investigators started hearing a very different version of what happened. According to federal prosecutors, Brian may have known about the bank robbery before August 28th ever arrived. That possibility changes almost everything. Kenneth Barnes eventually told investigators that Brian was not simply a random delivery driver selected at the last second. Instead, Barnes claimed Brian had been involved in discussions about the robbery and understood that he would be the person walking into the bank. Prosecutors came to believe Brian had agreed to participate in a version of the scheme. Under that theory, the bomb collar was supposed to make him look like a hostage. If police caught him, Brian could point to the device around his neck and say, "I was forced to do this." Meanwhile, the real organizers would remain somewhere in the background, separated from the robbery itself. On paper, that sounds clever. Yet one enormous problem immediately appears. Why would Brian voluntarily agree to wear an actual explosive device? The answer, according to the government's theory, is that he probably did not. Some investigators believed Brian expected the collar to be fake, or at least believed he would be able to get out of it safely once the robbery was finished. Others involved in the conspiracy may have known something Brian did not. Namely, the device was real. Suddenly, Brian's behavior on the pavement begins to look different. Remember how desperate he was when police stopped him? At first, he kept trying to explain that he needed to continue the route. Later, he became visibly more anxious as time passed. Eventually, he heard the beeping and warned the officers that the bomb was about to explode. Nothing about those final minutes looks like a man calmly acting out a fake hostage scenario. Whatever Brian may have known before arriving at the television tower, by the time police had him sitting on the ground, his fear appears completely genuine. And that creates the central question of this case. At what point did Brian stop being part of the plan and become trapped inside it? His family had a very clear answer. From the beginning, they insisted Brian was completely innocent. They rejected the government's suggestion that he knowingly participated in the robbery and argued that he was simply doing his job when he delivered those pizzas. To them, the explanation was straightforward. Brian arrived at the tower, was attacked, had the collar forced onto him, and was sent into the bank under threat of death. Their frustration only grew when authorities publicly described him as someone who may have participated in the conspiracy. After all, Brian could no longer defend himself. He could not sit in an interview room and explain what he had been told. Nor could he challenge Barnes's version of events. Barnes, meanwhile, had very obvious reasons to cooperate with prosecutors. By the time he began providing detailed information, he was facing serious legal trouble of his own. Cooperation could help him. That did not automatically make his account false, but it gave Brian's family another reason to question it. Even investigators had to deal with the fact that the people telling them what happened were hardly neutral witnesses. Marjorie Deal Armstrong had her own interests. Barnes had his. Rothstein died before the federal case ever reached trial. Roden was dead. Brian was dead. So the final story had to be reconstructed largely from physical evidence: documents, phone records, witness accounts, and statements from people who sometimes blamed one another. One detail, however, bothered people on both sides. Brian apparently knew enough to carry out the robbery exactly as instructed. He arrived at the bank with the cane gun. Inside, he produced the demand note. Afterward, he went toward the next scavenger hunt location rather than immediately driving to a police station or trying to remove the caller himself. That behavior could support the idea that he had been threatened. Equally, prosecutors argued it could show that he already understood at least some parts of the plan. Neither explanation completely solves the puzzle. Consider the caller itself. If Brian believed the entire setup was fake, then the plan makes a twisted kind of sense from his perspective. He walks into the bank wearing what he thinks is a convincing prop. Police catch him. Brian tells them kidnappers forced him to do it. Everyone focuses on finding the imaginary kidnappers while the people who actually organized the robbery divide the money. But suppose Brian reached the tower expecting a fake bomb and discovered that the people waiting there had built a real one. At that moment, the entire balance of power changes. Now he cannot simply walk away. Now refusing to rob the bank may get him killed. Now people he thought were partners have complete control over him. Most disturbing of all, Brian may suddenly realize that the fake hostage story was never designed to protect him. Maybe it was designed to explain his behavior until the caller eliminated him. Federal investigators ultimately described Brian as having participated in the conspiracy, but becoming an unwilling participant when he learned the device was real. That distinction is important because it means two apparently contradictory things can both be true. Brian Wells could have helped plan a crime, and Brian Wells could also have been murdered by the people involved in that crime. Those ideas do not cancel each other out. In fact, together they make the story even darker. Imagine agreeing to take part in a robbery because you believe everyone understands the plan. Then imagine arriving at the meeting point and realizing your partners have changed the rules. Instead of a harmless prop, they lock steel around your neck. Rather than trusting you to keep quiet, they give themselves a way to make sure you never talk. From that moment forward, every instruction you follow is technically part of the crime you agreed to commit, but every step is also being taken with explosives inches from your throat. That may be the closest anyone ever came to explaining Brian's final afternoon. Still, his family never accepted it. They continued to maintain that he had been an innocent victim from the start, and the precise extent of Brian's knowledge has never been established beyond all doubt. What the federal case did establish was that the collar bomb robbery involved a conspiracy far larger than one terrified man walking into a bank. In 2007, federal prosecutors charged Marjorie Deal Armstrong and Kenneth Barnes in connection with the plot. Barnes eventually pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. His testimony became one of the most important pieces of the government's case against Marjorie. During her trial, prosecutors laid out the story they believed had been hidden behind the bizarre scavenger hunt: the planned bank robbery, the collar bomb, the proposed murder of Marjorie's father, and the people who had been pulled into the scheme. By then, Rothstein was already dead from cancer. Roden had been murdered. Brian had died on the pavement. Only a few of the people who could have described the original plan were still alive. Eventually, a jury convicted Marjorie on federal charges connected to the collar bomb robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison plus additional time. Barnes also received a lengthy federal sentence, although his cooperation later reduced it. Those convictions answered the legal question of who participated in the conspiracy. They did not answer the question that most people still ask after seeing Brian's final minutes. Did he know? Maybe he knew about the bank. Perhaps he knew about the fake hostage story. Possibly he even knew there would be something around his neck. But when you watch his reaction as that device starts beeping, one thing becomes very difficult to believe. Brian Wells did not look like a man who knew he was supposed to die. And when investigators finally examined the scavenger hunt as a complete system, they found an even more chilling reason to think he never had much of a chance. because the question was no longer whether Brian could follow the instructions fast enough. The real question was whether anyone following those instructions could have survived them at all. By the time Marjorie Diehl Armstrong finally went to trial in 2010, 7 years had passed since Brian Wells died on that pavement in Erie. Nothing about the case had become simple in the meantime. Investigators had conducted nearly 1,000 interviews and pursued an enormous number of leads, while technicians took apart the collar bomb and detectives tried to reconstruct the conspiracy from people who often accused one another. Instead of producing one clean explanation, all of that work left behind something messier. Marjorie insisted other people were responsible. Kenneth Barnes told prosecutors that she had been at the center of the plan. Brian's family continued arguing that he had never willingly joined it at all. Rothstein, the man whose house connected the television tower, the frozen body, and the mechanical side of the conspiracy, was already dead and could never be questioned in court about Brian's death. Eventually, a federal jury convicted Marjorie of the major charges tied to the collar bomb robbery. Then, in 2011, she received a life sentence in federal prison. Barnes had already pleaded guilty and received 45 years, although his cooperation and testimony later helped cut that sentence in half to 22.5 years. Reuters. So legally, the government had its answer. Yet the part that stays with people has never really been the courtroom ending. What makes this case so disturbing is what investigators came to believe about the papers Brian carried with him. Remember, those instructions appeared to offer hope. Follow the route, complete the tasks, find the next clue, keep moving, and somewhere near the end there was supposedly a way to survive. Every page encouraged Brian to think that time was his enemy, but obedience was his escape. At first, that makes the scavenger hunt sound cruel but logical. Maybe the kidnappers needed him to prove that he was following orders. Perhaps each stop was meant to delay police or make surveillance more difficult. However, once investigators studied the entire system, they began to suspect something much worse. According to reporting on the FBI's later conclusions, the scavenger hunt was essentially a deception. Wired. Rather than providing Brian with a realistic route to freedom, it appears to have been constructed around the illusion that a route to freedom existed. One clue led to another. Another stop consumed more time. Each new instruction kept him moving, kept him focused, and kept him from doing the one thing that might have exposed the people behind the plan, stopping everything and trying to explain who they were. Meanwhile, the bomb itself had been built to make rescue extraordinarily difficult. Investigators found a device filled with confusing components and features that made simply cutting it away extraordinarily dangerous. More chillingly, the FBI reportedly concluded that attempts to remove the collar would have caused it to detonate. Wired. That means the promise at the heart of the game may have been false. Imagine Brian driving through Erie believing that somewhere ahead of him was the next clue that would buy him another few minutes. Now imagine the people who wrote those instructions already knowing that there was no final move that would truly make him safe. Suddenly, every mile he drove becomes sinister. The bank was not the finish line. Neither was the first clue. Nor was the next container waiting beside a road. All of it may have been theater designed for one audience, Brian. If he believed survival was possible, he had a reason to obey. While he obeyed, the conspirators got what they wanted from him. Should police stop him? The enormous collar made his hostage story believable. If he somehow kept moving, the route carried him farther through a maze of instructions. Once the timer reached its end, the most dangerous witness in the entire conspiracy would disappear. That possibility also explains one of the strangest features of the robbery. Brian was almost absurdly easy to identify. No mask concealed his face. His own vehicle carried him away from the bank. A bizarre cane gun made the robbery unforgettable. Police had every reason to find him quickly. Ordinarily, those would be catastrophic mistakes for a bank robber. From the planner's perspective, though, maybe they were not mistakes at all. Brian did not need to vanish forever if he was never expected to live long enough to testify. That is why the question of whether he knew about the robbery beforehand almost becomes secondary. Suppose prosecutors were right and Brian had agreed to participate. Even then, agreeing to rob a bank is not the same thing as agreeing to have a functional bomb locked around your throat. Picture showing up expecting some version of a scheme that would leave you with an alibi if police caught you. Instead, somebody secures cold metal around your neck and lets you understand that the danger is real. At that instant, whatever agreement existed before is over. From then on, Brian is no longer simply following a criminal plan. He is trying to survive the people he planned it with. Perhaps that is why his final minutes are so uncomfortable to watch. There is no triumphant getaway. Nobody rushes in with a last-second solution. Brian does not uncover the final clue. Instead, he sits handcuffed on pavement while officers keep their distance and a bomb squad races toward him. Across those final minutes, the entire elaborate conspiracy collapses into something painfully simple. A man has a bomb around his neck. Everyone can see it. Nobody can get it off. Then it explodes. Marjorie remained imprisoned after her conviction, while Barnes became the government's most important cooperating witness against her. Neither outcome could recover the one account investigators needed most. Brian's version ended at 3:18 p.m. on August 28, 2003. Because of that, no court could ever completely settle what he knew before arriving at the television tower, what he expected to happen there, or the exact moment he realized he had been betrayed. Maybe his family was right and he knew nothing from the beginning. Possibly prosecutors were right and he knew about the robbery but became an unwilling participant once the real bomb was placed around his neck. The transition federal authorities themselves said may have occurred. Either way, the last part appears painfully clear. Whatever Brian believed when he started that afternoon, by the time he was sitting in the road listening to the collar beep, he wanted out. And the people who designed the game may never have intended to give him that option. That is what makes the pizza bomber case so much darker than an elaborate bank robbery. It looks, at first, like a story about a man forced to race against a clock. But the closer you get to the end, the more horrifying the possibility becomes. There may never have been a race to win, only a clock. And Brian Wells may have been the only person who did not know that until it was too late. Thanks so much for watching today's story. Let me know in the comments whether you think Brian Wells knew about the robbery before that bomb was locked around his neck. Meanwhile, if you're in the mood for another case where one strange detail leads to something much darker, there's a whole playlist waiting for you right here. Go ahead and pick one, but maybe skip anything that comes with a countdown timer. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.